Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Bruce Porter. I'm the chair of the Department of Computer Science, and this is the home of the department. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to just make a few brief remarks, mainly thanking people who have made this event possible, beginning with Casey Reas. Casey, thank you very much for making this event possible. And you may not know that Casey came and spent a day with us in our environment to learn about our community, to meet our faculty and students, staff, and I hope it was inspirational, but the work speaks for itself, so I hope we had some small part in that. I'd also like to thank Andre Bober. Andre is the founding director of UT's Landmarks program, and she's a delight to work with. More from Andre in just a minute. I'd also like to thank Doug Dempster. Doug is the Dean of Fine Arts, the College of Fine Arts here on campus, and a strong supporter of landmarks. I don't think Pat Clubb is in the audience today, is she? Pat? But thanks also to Pat Clubb for helping to lead the landmarks program in such good directions. Within landmarks, thanks to a bunch of people that have made this event possible. Key to the project were the project manager, Nisa Barger, and the educator, Catherine Zinzer, and for development and event organization, Stephanie Tapp, for public relations, Nick Noble, and for design, Nisa Yamamoto. And finally, thank you all for coming and joining in our celebration. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Andre Bober.
It happens that some of the most innovative and resourceful leaders in science and technology here at the university are really eager to explore ways that art can resonate with their core areas of study. I've had the very good fortune to work with a number of these leaders, and because of their overwhelming support, Landmarks has not only just completed this wonderful project with Casey Reas, but we're also working on projects for Experimental Sciences Norman Hackerman Building, the McCombs Business School's Rowland Hall, and also the new Dell Medical School. And what I've discovered is that leaders like Bruce, they really teach us that crossing these disciplines has a profound impact on teaching and learning, research, and scholarship. So thank you, Bruce, for believing in landmarks, for leading this project to have Casey Reas' work here, and really just for making it possible for us to share this work with so many people. I'd like to also thank some members of the team, Bruce's team, who've been such a pleasure to work with. Patty Spencer, the Director of Operations, Matt Larson and Matthew Walker for their help with facility support, Judy Daniel and Stacy Mormon to help plan this event. I also want to thank Michael Zishang and Andy Gordon. They're in university operations and they provided outstanding support. Finally, I'm also going to add my thanks to Dr. Pat Clubb because she deserves to be thanked twice, I think. Very supportive. So let me introduce our speakers. We are so honored to have two luminaries in the art world here with us tonight. Leading the conversation is Christiane Paul. She is Associate Professor at the School of Media Studies at the New School, and Adjunct Curator of New Media Arts at the Whitney Museum of Art. She has written extensively on new media arts and lectures internationally about art and technology. And Christiane also wrote a wonderful essay about Dick Casey and the work outside that you can read on the Landmarks website. And Casey Reas has emerged as one of the leading artists in the field of software art. His work has defined both the practice in this field and the theoretical discourse surrounding it. Reas is currently a professor of design media arts at UCLA. His work has been featured in more than 100 exhibitions and venues around the world, and we are so proud to celebrate your work tonight. Thank you all for coming, and welcome.
Okay, thanks again for coming tonight. We're going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions and answers. And before we get to the commission piece that Casey is exhibiting here, we want to establish a little bit of background on his work in general and how he got to that piece and how his practice has evolved over time. So Casey will actually bring up work as we talk and present it up on the screen. And I want to return to some of the remarks that Andre has made in her introduction. As she pointed out, you really have been one of the people who has defined software art, ultimately. Software art as artist-written software, as opposed to using software for creating something. And you in particular have also pointed to the art historical connections between software art and previous movements such as Dada, Fluxus, conceptual art that are instruction-based, and you have referenced Solowit in your work quite a bit. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and show some work related to that.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm going to quit this.
We'll get to it later.
So start with a wall drawing?
Sure,
Okay.
Wherever you feel is appropriate.
So it was a decade ago, in 2004, I did a short, very didactic project where in 2004 there wasn't as much precedent for working with software as the studio practices I would say there is today. And so, as Christiane was mentioning, I was looking into the past and looking at other artist practice. I was looking at instructions written by different Fluxus artists. I was looking at Saul Lewitt's work. And I became so fascinated with his wall drawings, of which we have a really wonderful example right outside here. And what I became fascinated was not how they looked or how I felt in front of them, but the system of the drawings. How Lewitt would write a set of instructions and then work really closely with a draftsperson to then execute those instructions. And I was kind of trying to find other precedent for people working with something that was like code. And at that time, I was also starting to think about composers and how they work. The end result for a composer is a score, which is then performed and interpreted later on. But the end result then is the instructions for the wall drawing, or the end result is the score. And so for my work, the end result is oftentimes a piece of code that then executes or drafts visual ideas that I have in mind. So for this project, it started by looking at different sets of Lewitt's instructions. So if you can see that, I'll actually make it larger so you can read it while I'm talking. So these are the instructions for Saul Lewitt's wall drawing number 106. And oftentimes when I start a project, I just start by doing the obvious, the simple, the most basic thing. As I like to think through making rather than planning everything and then executing it. And so the way this began was just taking wall drawings and implementing them as software. And instead of having one drawing, instead you have more opening up the space of possibility for different wall drawings that this set of instructions could produce. So that's number 106. And instead of rendering one, it's rendered so that it can change in time. And then this is wall drawing number 358, a 12-inch grid covering the wall. Within each square, draw an arc from one corner.
And we actually commissioned this for the Whitney Museum's Artport website, and of course had to ask Solowit for permission to encode these works.
Yes. So this is wall drawing 358, which can, of course, it describes a system that can be many different drawings. And here we're just moving through different possible drawings that come out of this system encoded by Lewitt as a set of instructions. And I guess we could probably talk about Saul Lewitt for 45 minutes, but I should not do that. When he works with a draftsperson, they'll just define a the diagram for the drawing, and then it gets executed on the wall. So the draftsperson in this case will make the decisions about which art to make from which corner to what other corner. Here in software, we have the opportunity of exploring many of those without having to choose one. So we get a sense of the overall system, and we can experience it as the overall system rather than just one implementation or one set of decisions. Where should we go from here?
I think we should move from here to some of the software structures you have created. I think it's important to also point out that there are, of course, a lot of questions that this type of instruction-based art raises, and those were the same questions for Lewitt or for you. You know, people, of course, were asking about authorship. What does this mean in terms of authorship if somebody else, be it a machine or a human, executes those instructions? Where is the artist in this picture? You know? And you're giving autonomy to a system or to instructions. I think those are still questions that people struggle with a lot when it comes to computer-based software art.
I don't struggle with that question at all, actually.
No, you don't, but I think audiences very often do. Not everybody is deeply involved into this. But I think it would be great if you could also show some of your processes and software structures that you created.
Sure. So that project wasn't all about just re-implementing the Lewitts. That was the starting point of it. And the next step was to learn from that analysis and to start making something new. And of course, what's different about working in software is that we have the time domain at our disposal. And what the point I made before is that you can have the full system rather than just one instance of it. And so this was one of the very first sets of instructions that I wrote, where it says a surface filled with 100 medium to small size circles. Each circle has a different size and direction, but moves at the same slow speed, I think it says over there. And then here we're displaying the instantaneous intersections of the circles. So that's the set of instructions, and this is those instructions implemented as a diagram. So where the circles are overlapping, we're drawing points between those two points of intersection.
So in this case, it's a highly abstract image, and you actually moved from that one to a more aggregate version of it that becomes increasingly painterly, you might say. You know, it's of course a drawing.
I would never say that.
Some people would. At least when it's completed. It's also hard to see that in the beginning stages, but once this computerized drawing proceeds, there actually is, I think, different dimension it enters, you know, where people start to think about it as a different type of medium.
Yeah, so this short project led to about 7 years of work that came after it. And at this time, I was working a lot with the phenomena of emergence. And I would set up a set of small rules or instructions for defining the behaviors of these mechanisms, these pieces of geometry. And then I would then watch it unfold. And this time I was working a lot with trying to, on one hand, open up the fact that these are purely synthetic images and they're built out of these clockwork mechanisms, but then at the same time also having an organic quality too. And it was really influenced by the idea of thinking of atoms and thinking of how we can take these individual elements and combine them in different ways with different behaviors and to create a whole micro world or this whole other universe which is separate from ours through configuring these atoms in different ways. And this was the origin or the birth of that.
So I think what is important about your work, at least to me, is that, again, it bridges different worlds. There is a certain rootedness in conceptual art and instruction-based art, but it also is, as you just mentioned, an exploration of systems, of the emergence of systems that feel very organic. I mean, sometimes your works look like cells or tissues, basically simulating systems of the natural world. Yeah, and I think all of these elements very nicely come together. So we also should talk a bit more about the commissioned work, which I think is a departure from these earlier explorations. And on the one hand, a departure, and on the other hand, it of course still builds on the software and the use of software here. So could you talk a little bit about where the images came from? The sources for the murals that are being shown here actually came from an exhibition called Ultra Concentrated that was mounted at the Bitforms Gallery in New York in 2013. Can you talk a little bit more about these images and where they reside in relation to your work?
Absolutely. Can I show one of the older pieces first before I do that? Okay. I feel like what we just looked at is so visually impoverished that I just want to show you an example of where that went before we move on. So they were called software structures, and it was 1 through 3. After that happened, I changed the name from structures because it sounds sort of static and stable to processes, this idea that they're always moving, always changing. And so we started at process 4, and this is an instance of process 18. So this is where that work went over a period of years.
And you can actually see visual elements of the mural in there, you know, at least vaguely in terms of composition and color. Yeah.
Sure. This work builds over time, and then it reaches a point where it draws and erases more or less at the same state. It's almost like yes, and then it reaches a density and then stays at that density while the pieces move and shift around. But in this sense, I'm the author, and I've written the instructions and the behavior for these individual elements, but they draw autonomously outside of influence that I have once I set them off, set them going.
And I think it's also important to mention that your work does not always take the form of software, but has manifested in a range of materialities. Also in objects, you've also done stage designs, large-scale projections. So it's not all screen-based software as you're experiencing it right now. And of course, the mural is a good example of how that software can materialize.
Everything, it starts as software and then sometimes ends in different forms in the world. And I have a bad habit lately of collaborating with architects, and that end has a really different kind of result too. So the question before
was ultra concentrated and starting with the imagery that led to the murals.
I think we should look at some software for a moment. Software is not behaving well right now.
And while you're doing that, Casey, as some of you might know, is also the creator, together with Ben Fry, of processing. I don't know how many of you are using processing. Is anyone in the audience? Good. So that is yet another part of his practice, and again, a major contribution to software art as a visual environment for programming, and I think that has had a major influence on education and cultural practice. So now the software is behaving and running.
It is. I'm running, right now, processing 3, alpha software 4. So that's what happens when you run alpha software. This is the direct descendant of the piece installed outside. It was the origin for that piece. And it's built around television signals and the ones that are broadcast in the air. These were captured over rabbit ears in the studio. And then those images are then being, through the software, collaged in real time. Colors and textures are being pulled out and then reassembled. Cuts on the original camera are mixed with cuts in the software. And this piece I don't know what else to say about it.
Was it the first time that you worked with images from the mass media, television images?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that was quite a break in your practice. Could you talk a little bit more about how this imagery and this experimentation then evolved into what we're currently seeing on those walls? And then I also want to talk a little bit more about the title of that work.
Sure.
And where it's coming from.
Absolutely. So this was the original installation of this work as a diptych. We were just looking at one of the sides right now. This was at the Bitforms Gallery in New York in 2013. Another moment in time. And then around the corner, there are these series, which I call them control rooms, and they are these grids of prints. And these are still images taken from the software while it's running, and then built into these other organizations. And these are, again, the origin of the source material for the mural outside. And the other piece that is kind of an origin for this piece are these discs that you see on the opposite wall from the prints. And these discs use the images, these photographic images as their source material. And they take those two-dimensional images and they pull them apart into 3 dimensions based on the color data in the image. And then here you can see them, those lines which are being pulled into space are then etched onto this aluminum to make this piece. And as you may see, after having seen the mural outside, this is the origin of that piece very directly. This is another installation of a similar piece called Talk Screen at the Pasadena City College in January 2014. And then this is another one of these control room print grids. And then, so I took some of those images and some images that weren't a part of those series. We're going to look at those right now. And these, again, are the origin or the source material that we're working with for the mural. And then the next step was to take the source material, and to build this configuration out of it. And here we're taking small areas of those images, multiple images, and then putting them together into a single image. And this is the source material for the mural outside. And these are some variations on that. So that's the road or the path from where I was to where we are today. And I can also run the software that was used to create the images for the mural. So you can begin to get a sense of the full range of possibilities with the software. Of course, when it became an inkjet print in the end and a piece that's going to be on the walls in a static configuration, I made 2 selections. But there were, of course, many other different options or variables, and we can look at some of those while we continue to talk.
So did that work really organically evolve over time, or was there a kind of aha moment where you thought, oh, this is where I could take this, starting with a grid of imagery, further processing this? Was that more of a surprise moment, or was it an organic, long process that brought you here into that kind of experimentation?
There was a lot of red eyes and RSI feelings later. It was a really long process. And the way that I usually work is I start sketching diagrams of what the piece might be. And we talk a lot about, with processing, this idea of sketching with code. That when you work in any media, it's good to sketch in a media that's similar to your final media. If you're a composer, you're going to sketch with sound. If you're working in space, you're going to sketch with physical materials. If you're working with software, we think you need to sketch with code. And so start off writing small little pieces, well, very much like the first pieces that I showed. And then they start to form into something that is interesting. And I usually branch out in many different directions, and some of those branches die and others continue to grow. And for this piece, we tried a lot of different source material. We tried video games for a while. We tried many other kinds of media. And in the end, through a series of tests and experimentation, what I just showed in a neat line ended up being the direction it went. But there are a lot of discarded ideas and a lot of tens of thousands of files that eventually got deleted on the way there.
I also want to talk a little bit more, as I said, about the title of the piece,
Mm-hmm.
A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which does not sound like art at all. And the title is borrowed from Claude Shannon and one of his most influential articles in the formation of information theory. Could you talk a little bit more about why you chose the title and how it manifests in that piece?
Mm-hmm. The title of works that I have been doing, I did a series called Signal to Noise, which came from Shannon. And so for this time, I thought I'd just go right to the direct source rather than to kind of obliquely refer to it. And for me, a lot of this work is about the idea of entropy and this idea of, as a culture, we are building and decaying at the same time. Sometimes the net is decay and the net is building. And trying to take this mass media information and to sort of distort it in a way, to add too much entropy into it to the point that it begins to fall apart. And so that was the reference to Shannon. When I was a graduate student, this was a text that I read that I think, well, it had a large impact on me. And so it's a reference to these ideas that I've been working with for many years and just making a direct statement about it.
What I find particularly interesting about it is, of course, that digital art and computational art and systems also have their roots in cybernetics and information theory. Otherwise, we wouldn't have those machines we're working with every day. And Shannon famously proposed a theory for signal transmission, the signal being, or the message being encoded into a signal sent through the channel. You actually have the diagram here. Then decoded by the receiver and finally delivered to its destination, a human or a machine. And ultimately, you are applying this to some extent to art and to the viewing of digital art or new media art. Here is your encoded imagery, the signal that is being transmitted, and we, as the viewers, we're decoding. And as you said, the process of entropy, of the uncertainty in that transmission of the signal is also something that you experience in this art. When I look at that mural, and of course that's a very subjective reading, I'm very fascinated by this tension between familiarity and the unfamiliar. You know, like when you showed the source images, I can subconsciously see them for split seconds. There is something that is suggested to me of what might be in that image, and within a second it's gone. You know? So I think one of the really achievements of this piece is how it builds that connection between digital encoding and processes and the experience of art. You actually said you're putting the viewer into the middle experientially of that algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps you can talk a little bit more about the process itself of creating it, the signals, diagrams, the files that are being crunched here in order to get to this mural.
Sure.
It's also a nice contrast. The images you showed in the beginning were the white walls out there, and now we're
Do we have that? Let's see.
It was on your desktop what we.
So we saw it already. All right, I won't go back.
Started out.
Yeah, so this is a view of the mural which is purely digital before it really became material. And one of the ideas was that you would, when you see it there with your body in the space, that you can't take it in. It's something beyond what can be comprehended as a total, as a whole. But then as your eyes dart around, you can find these micro compositions or small moments where you can rest before jumping to the next. But this idea of continuously sort of challenging your perception and keeping your eye active, your eye dancing across the piece. You can never see this actually because of how the building is, well, your vantage point and your spatial view, but this is how the two pieces work together. And this was, I think, a document I mostly made for Bruce because it just honestly felt strange after months of work to say these are the two images that will, be the mural because it really came from so much potential. And so this was like a 143-day project. It went from February 10th until July 1st was actually the end day. The mural has roughly 4 million lines, and in the end, how many pixels is that? Many pixels. And then this was the process that it went through, just in a really didactic way. You start off with a movie that gets processed into an image, which then gets processed into another file format, which then goes through the final printing process.
So what I also find very important here, and that is a characteristic of software art, that you have these tensions in materialities. When it comes to a painting or a drawing, if you're standing in front of that painting, you can still see the brush stroke most of the time. Sometimes you have to move very closely, but at some point you'll see it. That is not the case with software art, where you're writing instructions, mathematically based instructions, and the experience on the front end can be a highly visual one. Nothing of that original materiality, and as you said, your very didactic process behind it sometimes manifests in that immediate experience. And I think that is something that is truly unique to software art. I also want to return to that notion of visuality. If this were a drawing you would have done by hand or a painting, you would have thought a lot about the composition as you apply color to a canvas or a screen. How does composition and how do compositional elements manifest in your process when you're writing instructions? What is the compositional process behind creating a mural like that?
It's actually, I think it's fairly similar. I've never had a standard practice, but my understanding of it is that it's fairly similar. I write some code and then make an image from that, and then that image becomes the object that I think about and that I oftentimes have on the wall and spend time with. And then at that point, when I make a change to it, instead of making a change to it directly, I'll go back and I'll tune or refine the code and then produce another set of images. And so it's a lot of time thinking about the images and how to adjust them. But instead of making that direct change, it's an indirect change that then produces another image, which is equally flat and technical as the last one. And I think the other thing that's, well, that process of tuning can take a very, very long time. It's not just a matter of, well, the other thing that happens too, I think is more similar to a process of a photographer, where in the olden days, you go out and you take many rolls of film, you'd print the contact sheets, you go through and find what's working, some things you were trying to go for, sometimes you'd find something unexpected. And when I work with code, I don't just make one image and then that's what I reflect on. I oftentimes make 100 images or 1,000 images, and I move through them very, very quickly. And ones that make me pause just for a little bit longer than the others get saved, and I go through them. And then it's a culling process. And then from those, I look at how can I make the majority of the images more like this, and I'll go through and tune those as well. So it's this generate and edit and tune, generate, edit, and tune, and just continues until the piece is finished.
I also want to talk a little bit about the materiality. We're talking so much about software here and generative software, but of course what you're looking at is murals, you know, a static image on a wall. Yeah, so it's a work that is really based on generative software processes, yet takes the form of visual images on a wall. How do you think about your work? What is your relationship to that image? Do you see it as an evolving software and just one still image from an evolving series? What's your relationship to that image? And of course, that relationship will be different for every viewer without knowing about the background and the software-based background of those images. Some people, in fact, might take it as a single composition.
Well, I've always, ever since the beginning, worked with dynamic moving images that, and static images at the same time. Almost every show I've had both in them. And I think that, for me, the fact that it's code is not really of consequence. It's the fact that I'm defining a system, which for me is what is of the primary importance. And so code is the only way right now that I can define the systems in the way that I want to. And so I've always felt that it's in trying to reveal the system, which I think is the core of the work, having a kinetic version and then having selected still images from that, it allows you to really see what that system is better. It's like looking at the same thing through different lenses or perspectives to get a sense of what the core element is. So the static images, I think, reveal something about that you miss when looking at the kinetic images and vice versa.
Before we open up for questions, I also want to talk a little bit more about those systems in relationship to art. Systems-based art and systems aesthetics were also a main topic in the 60s, of course. Jack Burnham, who at the time was the co-editor of Art Forum, wrote very influential articles on systems aesthetics. And of course, the computer has changed that thinking about systems or the implementation thereof and how artists can work with them. Yeah. So a lot of the systems-based art in the 60s actually was analog, you know, and the system could have taken a material form. It was not necessarily software-driven. That also goes for generative art, which, if you define it as a process that is set in motion through a rule set with a certain amount of autonomy, has existed for centuries. And you actually have a very nice image, I think, of some early generative art. You can think about, for example, ancient Islamic tilings as generative art that unfolds on the basis of rules and rule sets. And that's, yet another example, if you want to talk about it a little bit, the system behind those.
Oh, I don't know the system behind it.
No.
But, yeah, we were just talking about that a little bit. I just happened to have this on my desktop on my computer. It's from Carl Gerstner's book, Design Programs. And this is a cathedral that Gerstner would walk by every day. And so you can see that each of these windows has a similar frame to it. And I don't know if it was the architect who originally drew these forms or if it was actually the person who carved these forms out of stone. But you can see that they all have a similar aesthetic, but they're all unique and individual. So these ideas have been within the arts for hundreds of years, but I think now they're being re-explored through software.
And I know it's a big question and probably an unanswerable question, but what do you think are some of the key changes that software has introduced to generative practices and their experience?
Well, I think of we have a range of different tools that artists use. And I think that the tools before computers were largely tools that augmented the body. And I think of software and computers in general as artifacts that augment the mind. And so I think when I'm working with software, I'm able to work at a capacity that I wouldn't be able to. I can make things that I wouldn't have been able to make without using this as a way of augmenting my memory, my ability to process data. And so I think that scale is maybe the primary or the fundamental. I actually think that at the moment, where our culture is going, things that are produced by hand are far less interesting than things that are sort of mass-produced or manufactured. And so working with software also allows me to have things with this mechanical, sort of fabricated finish as well, rather than having that artifact of the hand. So I see the work as very much being an artifact of my intellect and my mind and my imagination, but I like not having my body involved in the final work.
And I think that's actually one of the tensions we see a lot in the art world. You always have the pendulum swinging back and forth between arts and crafts movements, which I think are also, maker culture is very strong, you know, because it provides a counterpoint to the disembodied practice that is taking over more and more. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also an important element to look at in that tension, which brings up another question for me. As you mentioned, software is being used more and more in design, in architecture, in art. So many objects we are seeing are ultimately the result of generative software processes and then put into material form. Is this something that you think we're just going to get used to without further thinking about it? Or do we really require more software literacy to understand these forms in depth? And you certainly have done a lot for literacy, I think, mm-hmm. Through processing when it comes to software and writing software. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How important is that to you or to the understanding of our culture today?
Yeah. I think that as a medium, software computers have a potential that we're just figuring out. It's very untapped still. And I think when young artist designers, even old, experienced artist designers, use computers exclusively as a tool, that, for example, the computer as a different kind of darkroom, or the computer as a different kind of drafting board, that it's efficient, but it's not exploring the possibilities. And so one really short statement that I've started to use with my students lately is, for example, in this class, we're not going to be learning how to use software, we're going to be learning how to create software. And I think when you have a basic understanding of what are the fundamental principles, what are the basics behind software, you can start to understand the limitations of these very powerful high-level tools that you use for production work. And so lately I've been, this is dangerous territory with computer science folks in the room, but I've been talking about it on Feynman's 6 easy pieces. I've been thinking about the 7 easy pieces of software because I couldn't get it in 6. But we have statements, we have variables, we have loops, we have conditionals, we have functions, objects, and arrays. And these are these core ideas. They're not embedded in jargon or embedded in code. They're not overly technical. They're powerful ways of thinking. And it's my goal to really convey these powerful ways of thinking to a much broader audience of artists, designers, and architects.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is one of the most important distinctions that needs to be made in art and the art we're seeing today. A lot of this art uses digital technologies as a tool for the creation of an object or a painting without reflecting on them. And then there is art that actually uses the characteristics of the medium that is about creation and reflects on these processes. And for me, that was always a very important art historical distinction to make. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have anything to add in general to our conversation right now. Otherwise, I would like to open it up to the audience for the
Sounds good.
last 10 minutes. Okay, questions?
That was really great stuff. Thanks for coming and doing it. I really liked it.
Thank you.
And I know Brooks has seen some. That's also really great.
Mm-hmm.
But I was curious. You said you have, when you generate about 1,000 frames, say, that are of interest, you also do a kind of state dump on all of those. You know what the state of the program was per frame, and you get back to it.
The important state.
Yeah.
I encoded in the file name.
What was the question?
Oh, sorry.
It had to do with how do you know what the software was doing on frame 843 that you liked? How do you know what it was doing and how do you get it back?
Yeah, so to repeat it again, basically keeping track of the software and its performance at any given moment. What was it doing for frame, you name the number, you know, and how much you keep a record of that.
Yeah, so the short answer is that I encode all the information that I need in the file name, so I can go back to it. What was the random seed that was used? What are the X, Y, and Z rotations that were being used there in the case of this piece? What frame was it? What was the source image? So I have very, very long file names, but they allow me to know how to reproduce it.
This question is really for both of you.
I can answer more later. Yeah.
Where is the place for these images in the art world? The art world, in my experience, has been somewhat resistant to the idea of the immateriality of computer work, and they want to see the brushstroke. There are a few, I started to say enlightened places, but a few places like Bitforms, computer science departments, places in California, but most of the art world, this is scary stuff. So even the name new media is a little bit sort of dicey. So where do you see this going? What's its place now? Is this the future, or is this part of the future, or in the art world?
Do you want me to start, or do you want to?
I can probably answer really quick.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really a question for you. Super question for you. I think it's a future. It's one of the futures for sure. And I've seen it change a lot in the 14 years that I've been making work. I've seen museums hire people into positions to curate or specialize in these things. What I'm really excited about right now is a lot of PhD candidates in art history are starting to write about these things, and those are the curators of influence in the future sometimes. So I've seen change. It's far, far too slow for my taste and expectations. It's been 50 years now since the very first images were made with aesthetic intent in mind. So 50 years. It's been a long time.
And yeah, we could talk about this for hours. Being at the Whitney Museum and dealing with new media, I'm constantly straddling that boundary or confronted with these issues. As Casey said, it's a 50-year history, and it has been a very rocky history for various reasons at various points in times. Many people have actually, many art historians have said that Kynaston McShine's exhibition Information at the MoMA was a kind of key moment, because up until then a lot of the computer-based work and conceptual art had still existed side by side. Yeah. Today very few people know about Hans Hake's work with computers or things like that, and at that point there was a break-off, and the computer-based art dropped out and the conceptual art continued to live on in the art world. Immateriality in and of itself, I think, is not the defining obstacle, because you see a lot of immaterial art practices. Tino Segal would be a prime example of a practice that is completely immaterial and that he wants to keep immaterial, and people are fascinated by it, and he gets solo shows at the Guggenheim. So I think the language of new media itself is not understood enough. I don't think that the average person looking at Casey's murals will see the complexity of what is going on. We need a lot more training in that. Other than that, I would say the future is already here. I mean, new media practice is so important. It is supported. It gets seen by probably more people than exhibitions in major institutions. The key point is getting that art into the mainstream art world a little bit more. And what is to me the most important part and also dangerous is that it is not being collected enough. And that means that it is not being preserved enough, and we're losing works basically every day. So that to me is a big concern.
As much as I hate to admit it, the work is fragile and unstable. and that's a barrier to collection. I think collection is one of the parts of the ecosystem, and I think this work has to be in every part of the ecosystem to be fully participating and healthy.
Yeah. Okay, there are 3 questions here. Why don't we go up 1, 2, 3?
So there's a question earlier about authorship and retention of ownership of generative code, that type of thing, and I think it kind of ties into the question you just answered about the collections, how it's hard to have generative code be a part of that. You stated that you have kind of pretty good clarity about how you feel about that. Can you kind of expand on that, especially with regards to once the process is done or once the mural is up on the wall, releasing of the algorithms that actually did that and that type of thing? Does that make sense?
I actually didn't catch the core question.
The core question is basically you stated that you have clarity about ownership and authorship of things that come out of these processes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious how you can be so sure about that when these are processes that run, take inputs, and can create, as you say, millions or billions of outputs.
Mm-hmm.
So can you expand on that? Does that help clear it up at all?
I'm sorry.
I would have a...
Can you start?
I could start,
Okay.
or I'm actually, I
answer.
don't want to put words into your mouth, but since systems for you are really, and the rule sets are at the core of the practice, that would be one answer. It's not, it's about that initial system or rule set that was created, and that is also where authorship resides, more than in the individual outputs, of these images. But,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to answer that for you.
I think it's a great answer. I mean, and the work is, I think with a lot of ephemeral work, it's documentation becomes that archive or that record of unique, and all the software work that I create that does go into collections is meticulously documented, signed, goes through the gallery that way, and so I think there is authorship, and there's also sort of the authority of the original in that piece too. I still may not have totally understand the question, but I'm around. Yeah.
There were actually 2 more questions.
I was just going to ask that the etching where you took the 2D image and pulled it apart.
Mm-hmm.
What was that called? Just so I can look at it.
I think it's called substrate. Mm-hmm. That's here. Mm-hmm.
There was one person behind you first.
I'm an architect, so I'm really fascinated by the kind of 4-dimensional quality of the piece that you were showing, the X, Y, Z, and time. And I'm wondering, and I love both kind of watching it go, kind of from that kind of viewpoint perspective, and also seeing it kind of installed in 3 dimensions on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you're satisfied with the kind of the physical presence of your work, either being on a screen or on a surface of a wall, or if you're like yearning for that to actually be in space and time.
I want it to be in time more so than in space, I would say.
You definitely see it as framed.
Well, I mean, if there were a material that was a 300 pixel per inch screen that could just be that wall, and there was a computer that could take care of that data for me at 60 frames per second, I would be very happy. And so, I mean, a lot of what I imagine to do is just not, I can't do it with the materials and the state of technology at the moment. And I've seen that shift in the last 14 years, and that's exciting. And I just always try and keep that in perspective. But yeah, so I work with the limitations of any given site and any given sort of infrastructure or platform that I have to work with. Like, for example, doing projects on buildings with a 6mm pitch LED screens, for example, it can be extraordinary, but it's still, it's not enough resolution, it's not bright enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I work with the platforms at hand, and I try and be happy with the results. I'm really happy with the results of this piece, I'll say, though.
It's not a question, but if you think it's appropriate, I'd like people to know that we have a Processing Austin meetup group in town.
Awesome. I did know that existed. So
we're part of the Processing Cities Network.
yes.
Yeah.
First Wednesday of the month.
Okay, great. First question in the back, yeah.
Going back to the work process, I'm curious, are the criteria that you use for selecting or creating code the same as those you use once you are looking at the output product and making the decision as to which frame to select for the wall? Or do you have separate criteria working in different parts of the process?
For me, the focus is always on the visual, and I manipulate, modify, tune, add parameters to the code in order to affect that visual output. So it's all optical for me, and the code is my way of getting to that searching for that output. It's all empirical.
And I would like to add to that that I find it very interesting how artists' perspective on that shifts, or different artists have different opinions on that. Some of them, like Casey, would say, I'm really focused on the visual, and that is the key point. There are others who would say the back end or the code is equally important, and in some cases, it's even more important for those artists who write code poetry and who see code as the creative writing and are not that interested in the visual front end. So I think that's also an important factor to look at, where people focus their
Yeah, absolutely.
energy in the process. Unfortunately, it has to be the final question now, but we can continue the conversation. I think you were first.
Well, this may be too big a question for a final question. Presumably, you didn't go at this with a really preconceived, fully conceived idea of what visually emergent properties you were trying to create. But you had this exploratory process of culling and tuning the code and the parameters. And something like a goal must have emerged for you. You just said, I was really happy with the result. And this may be a perverse question, but I'd like to get inside your happiness. Whatever you discovered when you were happy, the visually emergent happiness, what was it? It wasn't preconceived, but when you finally found it, what was it that made you happy?
I get myself in trouble sometimes using certain words. Like today in the Daily Texan, I was stated as saying that I found the process of art making, it was full of joy. So happy and joy. For me, that's, when I think about it intellectually, that's not what this work is about, but I've gone and said it twice in this week. It's something that makes me, I feel that it looks at and puts my head in I can look at it and it keeps me fascinated. And I think that's largely what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make things that are that are visually challenging in a way, and that also put me to thinking about. It's hard. I don't know. I'm gonna. No, it's a totally valid, good question, and I should just be able to answer it like that.
Have some very pronounced visually emergent features. So there's great things going on with depth in there, and energy and movement. And I could try to pin your work on. Okay, well he's trying to achieve some emergent properties of depth and perspective without using linear perspective and some traditional cues for that. But that would be way too simplified. It's not as simple as that. That wouldn't be fair, right?
Yes. I mean, I think, my honest answer is it's largely intuitive. And I think one thing that I haven't mentioned is there were 5 other potential very different directions for this mural that eventually got cut off. There were many things explored. And then once I sort of selected this area, which is the very neat walkthrough of the work that came prior and how it led to this, there was also an opening up and then a closing down. And so I guess maybe the thing to say is I just really trust my eyes. And I produce and produce and produce and gradually just find a point where I feel that an individual idea or work is at a terminus and then go to something else. Sure.
Okay, let's end it at that. Thank you. Thank you very much, and we can.
I didn't have a chance to do my laundry list of thank yous, but to just super quickly, this project it's really just been a pleasure from start to finish. It's an amazing group of people to work with, and Bruce has been wonderful to work with, and his team and his staff. Andre and your team and your staff, and Nisa in managing this has done extraordinary work. And to be able to have the opportunity to be here with Christiane and to be able to talk about the work, thank you all.